Well, Gus, thank you for that very kind intro. And thank you all this evening for coming along to listen, but in some ways, even more importantly, for all the help you've been able to provide to Pro Bono over the last 10 years, over the first 10 years. That's been incredibly important. Gus mentioned some of PB's achievements, hundreds of charities helped, hundreds of volunteers engaged. But tonight I thought I'd do something a bit different, which is not to look backwards, but instead to look forwards and to engage in a bit of futurology. Now, you may have spotted, economists' track record on forecasting isn't perfect. So this is a brave thing to be doing. So let me get the disclaimers off my chest early on. For what you're about to receive, you can't possibly blame the Bank of England, or Pro Bono Economics, or the government, any part of the government, or the opposition, or Donald Trump, or Nigel Farage. I'd love to blame them for all manner of things, but I can't, and that includes for what I'm about to say. These aren't necessarily their views, but let's hope we can do a little bit tonight of agenda setting by discussing how the third sector, and indeed society generally, might be reshaped by this thing called the fourth industrial revolution. I'm going to argue its effects will be profound for society, as in the past, but I'm also going to argue that the effects of it on the charitable sector, on the third sector, will be equally profound, and the opportunities that get thrown up, and also the significant extra endowments of both people and technology that will, I think, arise. However, harnessing those opportunities will require change, pretty profound change, I think, for the sector. And I'm going to offer some thoughts on that direction of travel too. So let's start with me saying a word about why this change might be needed and why it matters. This is kind of the lecture in summary, if you like. Well, the third sector, we all know, everyone knows it offers a huge amount societally, and yet, much of that is currently largely invisible. The profile of the sector is not as it could and should be. It's too low, and that doesn't help when it comes to getting policy attention, doesn't help when it comes to getting money, it doesn't help when it comes to embedding trust on the part of the general public. We also start from a position where not all, but some of the social sector starts with a relatively low level of technological penetration. Its digital and technological use is low, too low, in fact, and that in turn gets in the way of the sector offering as much performance-wise as it could and probably should. And the third element here I want to highlight is that we start from a position where what Raghu Rajan, former governor of the Central Bank of India, calls the third pillar of society, that is to say, community, having been chronically weakened and needing strengthening to beat back some of the malign forces of populism, of disconnection within society. And I'm going to argue that doing that, strengthening that third pillar, calls for a much bigger role for the third sector, working with individuals, with communities, and with societies. And that will come by better harnessing the possibility of technology and making better use of what I think will be a very significant extra endowment of people over the decades ahead. I'm talking about three areas of change, three, if you like, calls to arms for the third sector in the areas of measurement, in the areas of technology, and in the areas of the broader contribution of civic service to society. Suggest ways in which a new framework or partnership across these three elements might be brought together in helping strengthen that third pillar, in putting the third sector on a more level pegging with the public and private sectors. So let me start then with measurement, the first of those themes. And actually the key conclusion here is really very straightforward and simple to state, which is that at present, the contribution the third sector makes to our economies, and in particular to our societies, goes very largely, completely unmeasured. That may sound like a fairly narrow point, a nerdy point, but I think it's pretty important, carries important implications for both how the sector is perceived, how it's financed, how much policy attention it attracts, and how much trust is imbued in it. Out of sight invariably means out of mind. And if the sector, I think, has any hope of being seen on a level pegging with public and private sectors, that measurement gap needs to change. So what do we know about the contribution of the sector currently? Well, this schematic sets it out in fairly stylized terms. What we know, and as importantly, what we don't about the sector's contribution economically and socially. Now, the only part of the sector's contribution that is measured, is captured well in official numbers like GDP, is shown at the top of the pyramid. That measures the aggregate income or costs of registered charities. That's about 27 billion in 2017, which is about 1% of GDP. That's decent, but in the grand scheme of things, pretty modest. In truth, though, that's a potentially massive understatement of the true contribution for two distinct reasons. First, GDP ignores pretty much entirely all volunteering activity which, by definition, doesn't involve money changing hands. That's over 4 billion hours of time each year, or about more than 1 million people in full-time equivalent terms. Now, the ONS separately estimate the money equivalent value of that volunteering time. It's chunky. You could add about £40 billion per year on top to capture that. That's about 70 billion all in, second row of the pyramid, or about 3% of GDP. But of course, the very nature of charitable activities means that the social value created is often a large multiple of the economic value added, the cost. Charities create for a living public goods, social capital. They have natural societal positive spillovers. A homelessness charity's contribution obviously isn't measured just by how many people it puts a roof over their head. It's about the improvement they make to people's lives. That could be illness avoided, crime averted, jobs created, well-being enhanced, income boosted. All of these things and more besides need to be captured. They are tough to capture, but they need to be captured if this sector's contribution is itself to be captured. And of course, that was one of the very reasons pro bono economics was set up in the first place, to do just this 10 years ago, to better scale the contribution charities were making, not just economically, but societally. If you like, calculate some social impact multipliers associated with individual charities' contributions. This slide just gives a few examples, a handful of examples of projects we've done and the social impact multipliers they have generated. I won't go through them, but suffice to say, these multipliers suggest that the social contribution of, in this case, individual charities can be many multiples of their economic cost. And of course, that's what justifies this widest bottom row of the pyramid. The widest bit measures here the average of the social impact multipliers. And that then translates into an all-in contribution that's far larger, perhaps just shy of £250 billion on an annual basis. That's closer to 10% of GDP. Now you're talking real money. That's a massive contribution. And yet, that contribution at present is largely invisible in our official numbers. It's missing in action when it comes to most of the conversations about the import of this sector. We should fix that, shouldn't we? We should fix that. And if that sounds bad, it gets even worse, actually, because the second missing ingredient measurement-wise is this thing called productivity, much discussed right now, this thing called productivity. Now, it might seem a bit arid and indeed heartless to talk about efficiency and productivity when it comes to the third sector. But the hard truth is that whatever the sector, whatever the activity, productivity really matters if you are to make good societal choices. We cannot limitlessly grow our inputs. Ultimately, success lies in the use we make of them. And that's why productivity matters to us all, whatever sector we are in. It matters hugely to individual charities that they run themselves efficiently and effectively. And it matters hugely to the sector as a whole that it is using its resources as effectively as possible, especially if a big endowment of new resource is about to land on their lap, as I will argue in a second. And the truth is, the fact of the matter is this: when it comes to the measurement of productivity across the three main sectors, private, public, and third, this is how the situation looks. For the private sector, we make an attempt, albeit imperfectly, to measure all of it. For the public sector, we measure roughly half of it in productivity terms. And yet, when it comes to the third sector, the cupboard, productivity-wise, is completely bare when it comes to matters of management. The statisticians simply assume that charitable outputs and charitable inputs are exactly the same. We have no clue, no idea, from official numbers, how this crucial concept of productivity is measured for this crucial sector called the charitable. No idea. That, I think, is a little short of a scandal, isn't it? I mean, it's a particular type of scandal, a statistical scandal, but a scandal nonetheless that we have no idea. And if we are to reach good decisions on resources, societally, in individual charities, across the sector as a whole, that measurement gap really does need to be filled. I will come on to how in a second. Next, technology. When it comes to the third sector, this is a good news, bad news story. Let me start with the good news to cheer you all up, and there's plenty to report. It's very clear that digital technology, AI, big data, robots are transforming the third sector for the better in their effectiveness and reach. I give some examples here based on giving, around service provision, and around volunteering. I think Vivian and Jeff will both give many more examples of this good stuff happening, so I won't labour them here. But the truth is, these days, we can donate using Alexa. We can receive counselling courtesy of a chatbot. We can volunteer on our smartphones while eating our breakfast. And we can do all of those things pretty much 24/7. And that is a great leap forward. But, and you all knew a but was coming, That is not true of all parts of the third sector. I gave one or two bits of evidence here that speaks to the fact that in other parts, the long tail, if you like, of charities, the degree of digital penetration is much less. And let me make this point by drawing you a picture. Here's one piece of evidence. What it looks at is it compares charities red and companies blue, just in simple size, turnover terms on a log scale. Now, it's well known when it comes to private companies, that is to say blue, there is a very long tail of very small companies. And what's more, that very long tail of very small companies have very low levels of productivity. There is a long tail problem. Now, for charities, the tail size-wise is even larger. It's even longer, as the chart illustrates. And therefore, so too, at least prospectively, might be their levels of productivity. If it were based on size alone, then measured productivity in the third sector would be roughly half that among private companies for the average company. If you looked at other measures of dynamism, like entry and exit rates, or age, or spending on investment, you'd reach a similar sort of picture. What the evidence points towards is that there are out there some new, some thrusting, some large charities right at the technological frontier. But there are, at the same time, a long lower tail who have not yet fully benefited from the full fruits of even the third industrial revolution, never mind the fourth. Technology has not trickled down to that long charitable tail, which begs the obvious question: what can we do, what can be done to turn that technological trickle into a flood, to speed the process of technology diffusion down to the long tail? I'll come on and make some suggestions about how we might go about doing just that. Third, and finally, let me come to wider societal shifts that might result from the fourth industrial revolution. I'm going to briefly mention two of the three mentioned here. That's what it might mean for work and what it might mean for working lives. Now, starting with work, what might we see in the future? Well, what have we seen in the past? And Gus touched upon this. Well, over the past 200 years, it shows the pattern of the average working week in the UK over the last 220 years or so. And the shifts there have been pretty dramatic, I'm sure you'll agree. Back in 1800, the average working week was about 66 hours, and today it's around half that. As Gus mentioned, it's still well above where Keynes thought it would be at this stage, 15 hours a week. Some people in this room probably working 15 hours a day, I imagine. We're well short of that, but what Keynes got wrong was not the trend, just the timing. The trend he got right. In fact, if that trend would continue, the average person would be working a 4-day week by 2050, and Keynes' prediction of 15-hour week would come true sometime in the next century. And if, of course, the fourth industrial revolution means these trends speed up, if it means jobs are displaced, if it means more can be produced by fewer at a faster rate than in the past, we could see that rate of descent increase. This slide just gives some potential paths for the working week. They're based on different assumptions. They are necessarily speculative. Nonetheless, even on a central view, if the future follows the past, we are talking about the working week shrinking to around 27 hours by 2050. On a tech-propelled view, the working week might well be below 25 hours by 2050. That means we each will have an extra 5 to 8 hours each working week to play with. Now, whether we'll use those hours to play is a question I'm going to come back to. Before I do that, though, in parallel with this shrinking of paid work will be a stretching out of our working lives. We've seen that historically. We've seen rates of life expectancy increase dramatically over the course of the 20th century, from 46 years at its start to around 80 years now. And looking forward, if those trends continue, we're talking about well into the 90s by 2050. Of course, we also hear daily about our aging societies, suggesting we might be becoming less active over time. But age, as they say, is only a number, and in this case, it's actually a rather misleading number. The reason for that is because improvements in our lifestyles and our healthcare mean that even as our chronological age has been rising, our biological age has been falling. A 50-year-old today has the body and brain of a 39-year-old at the time I was being born. That's good news, right? It certainly cheered me up. So as someone who suddenly finds themselves back to being in their late 30s, what could be more exhilarating? And the same is true of all of you in this room, and indeed for the global population. So the global population has never been older as measured as years from birth. But the global population has also never been younger when measured as years left to live. And guess what? It's the second of those that matters to our economies and to our societies. Where we will be fairly soon is living 100-year lives, perhaps with 60 or 70-year careers. In other words, our working lives will expand by perhaps around a third, an extra 700 working weeks relative to the past. If we put these points together, less paid work and longer working lives, the net result will be the accumulation of a very significant hours surplus. I estimate that surplus by 2050, giving a working population of around 34 million people, could be anywhere between 10 and 16 billion hours each year. That begs the question, what will we do with those surplus hours? Will we, as Keynes predicted, use it for leisure? Well, I think I'm less convinced about that. Survey evidence, attitudinal evidence, strongly suggests both young and old want purposeful pursuits. A survey that PBE itself did with YouGov asked people this very question. If you had an endowment of extra time, how would we use it? And more than 40% said they would use it to volunteer, to take part in charitable activities of various types. In this table, what I've done is show some scenarios for how many extra billion hours of time each year might be allocated to the charity sector. So top right, for example, if only 25% of those extra hours was allocated to the charitable activity, then that would boost volunteering hours by around 2.5 billion each year. That's roughly a 50% rise from current levels. For more mid-range projections, more consistent with our survey, the boost could be a doubling or even a trebling of the amount of time set aside for volunteering and charitable pursuits. A massive resource endowment that begs the question, how best is it to be used. Were shifts to occur on even anything like this scale, I think we could see a reconception, a redefinition of even what work means, of even what we mean by contribution within society. It's only since the Industrial Revolution that we have viewed work and income as synonyms, as one and the same. In a world where paid and unpaid work are in greater equilibrium, there is a greater balance, I think there's a decent chance there could be a blurring in the distinction between them. We might revert to what the American composer Stephen Sondheim, his definition of work, which is basically what you do for others, as distinct from art or leisure, which is what you do for yourself. And that might also cause a shift in the social norms of how we measure contribution. It may no longer just be measured by someone's income contribution, their personal contribution to GDP. Civic scores, social scores may take on a greater significance, for better or for worse. I want to wind up with my suggestions, tentative, speculative, for discussion about what might be done. The three call to arms in the areas of measurement, in the areas of technology, and in the areas of society and civic service. That's about making the best use we can of that very significant endowment of both people and technology that could come, should come, the third sector's way. Starting with measurement. Back in 2005, the late, great Sir Tony Atkinson did a review of measurement of output and productivity and contribution in the public sector. We need, I think, an Atkinson review for the third sector if we are to better capture its outputs, its productivity, its broader societal contribution. Now, of course, that's not easy. It's very difficult, but nor is it impossible. One very fruitful line of pursuit, inquiry, and we've got Richard Laird in the audience as well as Gus, who can speak this much more knowledgeably than me, is the burgeoning literature on using well-being metrics to get at that otherwise tricky to measure social value contribution. And that's why well-being measurement, as Gus mentioned, is very much a central feature of Pro Bono's agenda currently and over the years ahead. Next, technology. A lot here that could be done. Let me mention just a couple of ideas of things that could be done to reach down into that long charitable tail, to speed up the process of technological trickle down in the third sector with a view to boosting performance and efficiency. A few years ago, for small companies, private companies, a new not-for-profit movement was put in place to help improve the performance of the long tail of companies. It's called Be the Business, and it does that by providing a platform that allows companies to benchmark their performance relative to others on the grounds that self-awareness is the first step towards self-improvement. And that model has worked. That model's worked in helping lift the productivity, performance, and technological use of those small companies. That same model, I think, would be relatively easy to replicate when it came to the third sector. We could have a Be the Charity to accompany the Be the Business in benchmarking charities, how far up the tech spectrum they are, and from learning from others about how to move themselves up that curve. Second, if the pro bono economics model of matching and curating skilled expertise into charities works, why not could the same model be applied when it comes to skilled technological advice? Why can't we pool the pro bono programs of the big tech companies, and having pooled them, then match them and curate them into projects large and small in the third sector, who might not otherwise have access or the money to transform themselves digitally? If you like, a pro bono tech. In the US, DataKind is doing this for data science. It could apply across a much broader technological territory, I think. Last, but by no means least, I want to come to the third sector itself and sketch a model, no more than sketch a model, a new model of how we might think about civic service, structuring, making more formal, more visible the process of civic service, making the best use we can of what could be a very significant resource endowment, making civic service a more central and structural part of people's careers, both young, middle, and older aged, reaching young and old, rich and poor, employed and unemployed, building, if you like, that third pillar I mentioned at the top of the show. So what would be the ingredients then that might make this up? You will have your ideas. Let me put on the table for the purpose of discussion one or two of mine. Well, to make this work, to make civic service a third pillar on an equal footing with public and private sectors, what would we need? Well, I think it should start in schools. Civic service is a habit, a good habit, and habits are best built early, embedded in the classroom. So I do think embedding citizenship in the school curriculum, not on a discretionary, but on a compulsory basis, is absolutely crucial, on a standalone basis. And not just in the classroom. Having kids out in their communities too, doing it practically, getting into the right habits at a very early learner's stage. Moving further up, educational spectrum. Might we need a greater number of formal qualifications into which people opt to nurture their interest in civic service? Anyone for C levels to sit alongside the existing O levels and the soon coming T levels? It might mean having volunteering as accredited training, something that could form part, for example, of an in-work apprenticeship scheme and make that even more of a success than it is already. It might mean creating a digital passport that records people's civic service and which can then be used as the basis for recognising and rewarding that practice. If that sounds fanciful, just try going north of the border to Scotland, where the Young Scot card is doing for young people in Scotland precisely this: a digital civic passport that serves, among other things, as a basis for both rewarding financially and recognising through awards young people's civic contribution. That passport could, perhaps should, be rolled out to both old as well as young, and perhaps even across the whole of the UK. It might mean establishing these things called time credits for volunteering as the digital common currency of service that can then be used as the basis for recognising and rewarding volunteer activity. I was down in, this exists already, so hundreds of charities already do this, but by no means all of them. I was down in Cornwall just at the end of last week in a charity that was granting time credits to its volunteers. And that was having a dramatic impact on the likelihood of people taking part and the satisfaction they got from taking part. This is by no means universal currently. Perhaps it could and should be as a genuine digital common currency for volunteering. So I hope that's enough to get us started the conversation this evening. And indeed, not just this evening. I hope some of this we might be able to take forward in the years ahead. Let me thank you all for listening. To thank you all for the past 10 years, but I think in some ways most important of all, to thank you all for the next 10. If even a fraction of what I've talked about this evening were to come to pass, it will require the help of each and every one in this room. We look forward to receiving that help, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks everyone for listening.